Welcome everyone to the Children's Policy Centre webinar series in conversation with Children's Commissioners. I'm Angie Bexley, Deputy Director of the Children's Policy Centre. I'm coming to you from Ngunnawal and Ngambri land in Canberra. This is land that has never been ceded, and I pay my respects to their elders and to past, present and future generations of their children and young people. And I extend my respect to all First Nations people who might be joining us for this webinar today. The Children's Policy Centre is based at ANU and has three key objectives. The first is to undertake innovative interdisciplinary research on a range of issues relating to children's policy. Second, to seek to connect researchers, policymakers and practitioners working on a range of issues to promote the human rights, wellbeing and best interests of children. Third, we aim to communicate research findings to contribute to better outcomes for children and young people. This is our fifth In Conversation webinar series with commissioners from Australia and overseas. We've covered a range of topics, from enshrining the UNCRC into Scottish law to conversations about the gendered nature of children's wellbeing. And this is our second conversation focusing on Victoria. The Victoria Commissioner for Aboriginal Children and Young People, Justin Mohammed, spoke about the inquiry Our Youth, Our Way, about the overrepresentation of Aboriginal children and young people in the Victorian youth justice system and the recommendations that came out of that report. This week is National Children's Week, and this year's theme is drawn from Article 15 of the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child on children's rights to choose their friends and safely connect with others. And so today we're going to be expanding on issues of safety and protecting children in the care of the state. And I'm delighted to be in conversation with Victoria's Principal Commissioner for Children and Young People, Liana Buchanan. Liana commenced her role in 2016 and has a background in oversight and system reform for people experiencing disadvantage, with a strong focus on family violence and sexual assault. Prior to her appointment as Commissioner, her roles included Executive Officer of the Federation of Community Legal Centres, where she led the peak body for Victoria's 50 community legal centres. Director of the Office of Correctional Services Review, where she was responsible for monitoring Victoria's correction system. Liana has also held legal and policy positions with a social justice focus in a number of agencies, including the Victorian Equal Opportunity Commission, Department of Justice, Office for the Status of Women in South Australia, and Women's Legal Service in South Australia. And Liana also sits as a part-time commissioner for the Victorian Law Reform Commission. And today, Liana is super busy with the tabling of her annual report in Parliament today. So Liana, welcome and thank you so much for your time today.
Thanks, Angie. No, it's really good to be here.
Now, Liana and I will talk for about 30 or so minutes, and then we'll have some time for questions and discussion. If you do have a question for Liana, please put it in the chat or signal in the chat and I'll direct it to you. So Liana, we want to talk about some of your recent inquiries detailed in your reports, Keep Caring and Out of Sight. But can we just begin by talking about your functions overall as Commissioner for Children and Young People in Victoria, as it is quite unique from commissioners in the other states, and how you go about doing that role?
Yeah, thank you, Angie. I too, just before I start, or as I start, would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we all sit. Wherever we are on this fine land. I'm on the land of the Wurundjeri people, and I pay my deep respect to elders past, present and emerging. Yes, so to start with the functions, you're absolutely right. We operate, as others may have mentioned, as a group of children's commissioners and guardians across Australia and New Zealand. And one of the really striking things is that we all have quite different roles. Some of them overlap, but some of them don't. And I don't think there's any other commissioner or guardian who has quite the mix that we have. So I kind of describe the functions that sit with the Commission in three ways. Advocacy functions, they're probably pretty similar to many of the other commissioners' functions. Really, it's about promoting the rights and interests and safety of Victoria's children and young people in a whole lot of ways, policy submissions, trying to advise government, trying to raise issues in the public domain and so on. We also have some functions that are probably unique. Certainly the combination are still at the moment unique. And these are what we call our regulatory functions. They're two schemes that we administer that are all about preventing child abuse in organisations. So they line up very closely, in fact, completely line up with recommendations from the Royal Commission into institutional responses to child sexual abuse. So we have mandatory child safe standards in Victoria that about 50 to 60,000 organisations have to comply with. And at the Commission, we are charged with educating organisations about those, but also we have a range of powers to assess compliance with the child safe standards and to enforce those standards if we need to. Those standards, that whole scheme is all about trying to make sure organisations take the steps they need to keep children safe and empowered in their organisations. It's very much a preventative scheme. And then the other regulatory scheme that I'll just touch on is a reportable conduct scheme. A couple of other jurisdictions have these, although I don't think any others sit with the Children's Commission. And that's a scheme that's very much about making sure that where there is an allegation of child abuse in an organisational setting, it's not swept under the carpet, it's not mishandled, as we saw was so often the case with matters in the past. So for a number of organisations, about 12,500, whenever there's an allegation of child abuse by a worker or a volunteer or a religious leader, that has to be notified to us, and then we oversee the way that's handled. So useful to flag because, as I say, while some jurisdictions have taken some steps to implement these standards, so far, New South Wales is the closest, but so far no other jurisdictions have those two schemes up and running in quite the way that's been recommended. Thirdly, and lastly, probably these are the kind of range of functions that we'll be talking about most today. And I call these our oversight functions. So we are, in our legislation, very squarely directed to play a role oversighting, monitoring, holding government to account for the services provided to children who are involved with child protection, out-of-home care and youth justice. And we do that in a whole range of ways. We monitor incidents in out-of-home care and youth justice, we review footage and so on. We have a visitor program into youth justice and we do inspections so that we can speak to children and young people in residential care. We conduct inquiries into responses to individual children. We hold, in Victoria, we hold the child death inquiry function. So whenever a child dies who's been involved with child protection, we look at the experiences of that child, the services provided to that child to make recommendations for change. And we do more in-depth systemic inquiries that are tabled in Parliament. And as I say, I think those are probably the inquiries that we're going to talk a bit more about today. So it's a pretty broad range of functions, gives us reach into lots of the systems and services that really impact children's lives. You know, I think it works pretty well.
Great. And so, Liana, in talking about your oversight functions, we're going to talk a bit today about vulnerable children and young people. And so it's really really important, I think, to really understand what that lived experience of vulnerability means. And your 2020 inquiry, Keep Caring, deals with the specific vulnerabilities of children and young people who are leaving care arrangements. Could you start perhaps by explaining what leaving care is and what are the specific vulnerabilities experienced by children and young people?
Yeah, absolutely. I've just realised as you were asking my next question, there were some bits of the last question I didn't answer, but they'll probably become apparent as we talk, because when we go about our functions, we take a very clear child rights approach. We're very focused on involving and hearing from, both working with and building in the voices of children and young people. And I think one of the things that doesn't make us unique, but we were the first commission to have a standalone commissioner for Aboriginal children and young people. So there's been incredible benefit, as you might imagine, in having Justin and his predecessor, Andrew, because it means that we can bring a very, very clear and very well-informed focus to the issues for Aboriginal children and young people in all of the work that we do, including the bits of work that we're going to talk about today. So the question about what is care and what is leaving care, the out-of-home care system, lots of people on the line will know, is really the system that applies or that exists to provide care for children and young people who have to be removed from their families because of actual or perceived risk of harm, always subject to court consideration and court orders. And so, of course, these are children, certainly in Victoria, there's about, at the moment, 9,000 children in our at-home care system. about 3/4 of those are in kinship care, another 20% or thereabouts are in foster care, and quite a small proportion, thankfully, in Victoria, about 450 kids at any one time are in residential care. So that's what care looks like. The whole topic of leaving care has really been quite a focus, as lots of people will know, in recent years, because traditionally in Victoria and still in many other parts of Australia, care, so that provision of support from the state, that assumption of guardianship by the state, stops at 18. And with that cessation of guardianship by the state, a whole raft of practical, financial, and therapeutic supports that hopefully, ideally, are provided to children stopped as well. So it has been a real focus in recent years, both here in Victoria and elsewhere, to look at what that means for children and young people, to look at how, frankly, how crazy that is, to assume that any young person, as soon as they hit 18, don't need ongoing stability and support and access to to guidance and so on. And so that's what the whole kind of topic of leaving care is about and is looking into. In terms of some of the vulnerabilities of young people in the care system, I sometimes like to reframe it, because I think calling children and young people vulnerable, it's very common, it's in my legislation, but it locates the issues in them. And actually, when you look at children in the care system, children and young people in the care system, these are children who have most likely experienced a degree of trauma and adverse experience through their childhood. And what we know this from an earlier inquiry that we conducted, we know that whilst it's a system that provides really well for some children, for too many children, it's a system of multiple placements, of not feeling like they have a say, of not having a kind of a worker or a trusted person that they know they can go to. For some, it's a place of actually kind of feeling less safe than they felt in their family home. So when you look at that context of some of the challenges in our out-of-home care system, you don't need to be a rocket scientist to kind of think that the children who are in care and who are progressing through adolescence as young people and getting ready to turn 18 and leave care, of course they're going to have a whole range of issues and a whole range of needs, as indeed would all children and young people, but of course young people with that kind of experience are more likely to. So I think that's one of the points that I'd made. When we look, as we did in this inquiry report, but what at the moment that translates to in terms of outcomes for young people who leave care, it's pretty devastating. So when we looked at it, and we were lucky, we accessed some data linkage that had already been done but hadn't been made public. And we looked at, for all of the young people who left care within a particular period of time, where did they show up in data set 3 years hence? So from that pretty rigorous methodology, we could see that 1/3 of care leavers are homeless within 3 years. A half of young people who leave residential care, so it's even kind of higher for those kids who have experience in resi. More than half required acute mental health services, 70% of young people who were leaving residential care. A quarter had contact with the criminal justice system, and again, that proportion for young people leaving residential care was much higher. It was half the young people leaving residential care had contact with the criminal justice system. And about a quarter of the young women were parents within 3 years of leaving care. Under half were involved in education and training at the time they left care. And when we looked at 3 years down the track, 70% of those young people were living below the poverty line. So when we looked at it, and some of the themes in that are not new and not surprising, but it's pretty cold, hard data to tell us that what we're doing for children and young people in care and the way we're supporting them into adulthood isn't working.
And it's quite shocking, I think, as well. You touched on there, Liana, intersection, some of the gendered outcomes. What did your report find about the intersection of disadvantage for Aboriginal children, young people, and people with disability?
Yeah, so one of the in terms of Aboriginal young people, the first thing to say is that everywhere across Australia, and actually particularly so in Victoria, Aboriginal young people are massively overrepresented in the care system. At the moment, it's something like 25 to 26%, and that when you kind of take into account that only a few percentage of the population of young people are Aboriginal, that's pretty stark and pretty appalling. When we did this work and looked at young people in care preparing to transition, it wasn't quite at 26%, it was about 22%, so still a pretty high number. So the first point that I would make, and that we made in this report, is that all of the disadvantages, all of the negative outcomes that we are not managing to turn around for all young people who leave care, Aboriginal young people are being disproportionately affected by that. So if you're talking about homelessness, if you're talking about entry into the criminal justice system and a whole raft of other negative outcomes, we're seeing Aboriginal young people being disproportionately represented. On top of that, we looked pretty closely at what Aboriginal young people said their experiences were and what their needs were in terms of staying connected to family, staying connected to culture and to community. And again, while we found some examples where that was being supported really well, by and large, that was not the case. Even when we looked at the extent to which Aboriginal care leavers were able to access support from Aboriginal community-controlled organisations, so where there was post-care support available, how many Aboriginal young people could access that? And actually, when we looked at it, only a quarter of Aboriginal young people who were leaving care could access the support they needed from ACOs, from community-controlled agencies. So we made, as you can imagine, some pretty strong recommendations about it, because the evidence is pretty clear that if you can get support that is provided by an Aboriginal community-controlled organisation, the prospect of that being culturally safe and appropriate is far higher. In terms of the issues for children and young people, young care leavers with disability, there were a couple of things. Certainly in Victoria, the system does not collect or have good data about young people in the home care system and disability. They now are starting to collect it when young people and children come into the system, but we still are a long way from having good information, certainly about young people about to leave care. When we looked at it and we did for this inquiry, we spoke to young people, we spoke to many stakeholders, and we did in-depth file reviews as well as seeking data. And when we did some file reviews, we estimated that a third of the young people leaving care had disability. Intellectual disability was particularly common. And we noticed some particular issues for young care leavers with disability. We noticed that lack of housing options was a particularly severe issue for young people with disability. We found that many young people with disability, the planning and transition out of care was often affected by very late planning. So if they needed post-care disability supported accommodation, the planning for that was often done very late, and that's not easy to set up. So often that led to pretty awful outcomes for those young people. We also saw that planning was really affected by poor collaboration, and sometimes no collaboration, between NDIS and child protection. And that again resulted for some of the young people whose experiences we looked at in some pretty awful outcomes. And similarly, case managers in the child protection out of home care system didn't really know enough often about how to navigate NDIS. So leaving care, the reliance on NDIS stepped up for many of these young people, and the knowledge about how to navigate that and get the necessary outcomes from NDIS, the necessary supports in place, that was often lacking, and again left these young people in pretty awful positions after they turned 18.
And I mean, you've spoken there, and I think it probably, the disconnection between these systems that you've spoken about for Aboriginal people, for people with disability, probably serves for everyone. Can you tell us a little bit more about how the system has generally been dealing with leaving care?
Yeah, one of the things that we looked at, and I'll kind of come back to, because clearly one of the one of the reasons that we did the inquiry was to further build the case for proper post-care support. But one of the things that we looked at really closely that, to my mind, hadn't really been examined, certainly in Victoria, was what's actually happening while young people are in care. You know, there's a whole raft of guidelines and practice requirements about what's meant to be happening for young people as they, certainly in Victoria, as they turn 15. They're meant to have a transition plan prepared that they have input into and that they're working on then for the years to come. So we looked pretty closely at that. And what we found, unfortunately, was that less than half of the young people who were meant to have a care plan and a transition plan had one. Less than a third of the young people who are meant to have a transition plan had one that was finalised or signed off in any way. So even kind of putting the basics in place was not there. We looked at things like, by the time young people then were leaving care, what had been put in place. So we looked through file reviews. We found that about half of the young people leaving care needed mental health supports, but of those, only a third of those people who needed it had been supported to get it or access it. We found that by the time those young people were leaving care, about half had disengaged with education and didn't have employment, but there was actually, in most cases, no or very little evidence of efforts to address that. So there were kind of, you know, that work in the lead up just had not happened. And more generally, what we found was, you know, the work to prepare young people with independent living skills, to repair relationships with family, because we know that post-care, certainly post-18, a lot of young people do reconnect with family. Those efforts just in the main hadn't been done. It's really easy when I talk about this, and this applies to the other inquiry. It's really easy for me to sound that I'm being incredibly critical of the system, and I am being critical of the system, but that can also be read as I'm being critical of the workers, of the agencies. You know, I appreciate that, and it can be hard for people to hear, but there is a reality that we have an incredibly pressured system. And, you know, and I've, in various inquiries, detailed the caseloads that workers have, the extent of turnover in the system, which means that it's actually very, very hard to get any kind of consistency, the vacancies in the system, and the number of unallocated cases and so on. So I want to kind of make mention of that, because when we're talking about these problems, I think it's really important to focus, as I do, on what that means for children, and it's my job to focus on that. That can kind of feel to individuals who are working the system that I'm kind of taking a swipe at them. It's not the case. I know that there's lots and lots of incredibly hardworking people trying to make the best of it, and I think they have a tough job, but the system simply is not enabling them to do what young people need. The other thing that I would say about the current settings, in terms of support, as I mentioned, up until the last few years, I can't remember exactly when the pilot came in, but it's since I've been Commissioner. Up until then, support largely cut off for young people at 18. We had then in Victoria a pilot to extend kind of what we call home stretch and better futures, and provide some supports to young people up until they're 21, but that only applied to a very small number of people. So when we looked at this in our inquiry, only a very small proportion of care leavers could access those supports. We heard great things about them from those who were accessing them, but only a very few could get them. The good news is that now, so by the time you're asking me today, the government has actually made a commitment to expand that. So the settings today in terms of post-care are actually much better. That allowance, the financial support doesn't just suddenly cut off. The supports in terms of case managers and so on doesn't suddenly cut off. So that has been, an incredible step taken, or set of steps taken by the government since our report was tabled.
Yeah, that's fantastic news. There's actually been movement and progress on all of this work that you're doing to reform the system, because as you say, and many children and young people in your report say, you know, if they can form a connection with their workers, you know, that's fantastic, but it's the system that's just not letting them be able to enable all of these parts together. So that's really great news, Liana. Your 2021 inquiry, Out of Sight, deals with another specific vulnerability experienced by those in care. Can you tell us a bit more about the patterns of who go missing and who are absent from in care? What's the sort of scale of this problem, and what did the children and young people tell you about their experiences?
Yeah, so this, in a way, we could have looked at this issue about young people going absent or missing from care across the whole of the care system. But as I mentioned at the beginning, one of the ways that we monitor the out-of-home care system is that we receive every single incident report relating to it, for every incident that happens relating to a child or young person in care. And it was very clear from monitoring those incidents that the issues for young people in residential care going missing was both acute and much more acute than across the rest of the system. So this inquiry looked at just that. It looked at what happens for children and young people when they go absent and missing. How common is it? Why do they go? And how is it being responded to? What does best practice response look like? So in terms of what we found, so as I said at the start, there's about 450 children or young people in residential care at any given time. We looked at it over an 18-month period. That was about 950 children and young people. And during that same time, there were over 2,300 reports of children going missing and about 7,500 warrants. So what that kind of computes to is that's about nearly one warrant for every child in residential care per month, which is about 75. We'd kind of, compared that to research about children going missing in the broader community. It's about 75 times the rate of children and young people going missing in the broader community. So, that confirmed for us what we were seeing in the incident reports, which is that it's a pretty significant problem. The other thing, though, that I would say about the incidence of children and young people going missing is it is massively, even the data that I've just referenced, it's massively understated, because one of the big things that we found is that there are wildly inconsistent approaches to responding and to even reporting when children and young people go missing. So we would find some cases where the agency had a policy of waiting for 3 days until a report was made. Others would make the report straight away. Others would, if a child was away for a period of time, just make a new report every 5 days. We had one case where the young person was away for 5 months. I think it was a 15-year-old was away for 5 months and there was only one report. So relying on reports as an indicator of how often children and young people go missing clearly isn't reliable. That's, that was a finding in itself. In terms of who the reports are made about going missing, I mean, residential care in Victoria, we've managed, the government and the department have managed to keep that fairly contained, which is really positive. Ideally, it is, if at all, only used for older children and young people. But 60% of the reports of young people going absent or missing related to 15 to 17-year-olds, 60%. About a third were children 12 to 14. But actually, unfortunately, some younger children are in residential care, and we absolutely saw reports of children as young as 7 in residential care and going absent or missing. Seeing reports of 11-year-olds going absent or missing, unfortunately, is not uncommon still today. The only other thing we found, kind of looking at what the issues are for Aboriginal children and young people, we didn't find that they were reported as going missing at a higher rate, but they were reported, they were the subject of warrant applications at a slightly higher rate. So that was kind of interesting. Girls were far more likely to be reported as going missing than boys, but when we did the consultations, which we spoke to many different people, there was a very strong theme that an assessment is made about relative risk and vulnerability, and that it may well be, and in fact many people said it is the case, that young men will be less likely to be the subject of a report because an assessment will be made about the fact that they'll be okay, they're not as at risk. So those were some of the factors that we could determine. In terms of what happens to them and what they say, happens to them when they when they leave care or go absent from residential care. The report's pretty scathing, and certainly what children and young people tell us, what the incident reports tell us, is that a really high proportion of children and young people, when they're missing, are experiencing pretty significant harm. So some of that is physical violence. A very high proportion of children and young people going missing are experiencing sexual exploitation. Almost 40% of the incident reports, the absent client incident reports that we reviewed, almost 40% of those referenced that the children involved were at risk of or were involved in sexual exploitation. And we saw some evidence and heard to a lesser degree from young people about evidence of them being caught up in criminal exploitation, so getting caught up with criminal offending as part of a kind of bigger group and under the influence of older people. So very, very clear information that the harms that are experienced by young people when they're away from care are pretty significant. And again, go back to, these are young people for whom the state has stepped in to keep them safe. And the reality of what is happening for these young people in particular is very far from that.
Mm. You've spoken a number of times now, just touched on the importance of connection and how important that is to young people, children's and young people's experience of being in out-of-home care. How much do you think the system itself understands the reasons for children and young people leaving care?
I think people in the system, well, it's a good question. Many people in the system understand. Many people in the system could tell us, as did the young people, that they go missing or leave residential care because they don't feel connected to it. It doesn't feel homely to them. For some, it feels absolutely unsafe. So in a number of inquiries, we've heard from young people that they find residential care to be a profoundly unsafe place, usually because of the mix of young people who are placed there. And so for some young people, no matter what other dangerous environment they're going into when they are away from the residential care unit, they feel more in control of that compared with what they're experiencing in the resi care unit itself. So I think many people in the system know it's about lack of safety and lack of connection with anyone and with the place of the residential. It doesn't feel like home. Nobody there feels like the person that they trust. So they go seeking that elsewhere. That's very strongly what came through. Does the system as a whole understand that? I'd have to say no. And I say that because one of the things that really struck us when we looked at this and spoke to people and reviewed all the documents and all the guidance and all the reports and everything that's written about these young people and the way many people in the system talk about them, is that the terminology is to abscond. They are absolutely stigmatized. They are not discussed or described as children and young people who have a set of needs that aren't being met. They are discussed in ways that absolutely connects them with a kind of criminal context. That hasn't, we look at, back in the very origins of child protection legislation, child welfare legislation, actually children who had offended and children who needed the care of the state were treated in the same legislation in the same way. And kind of tracing that, in some ways we haven't moved that far. So we've and the young people themselves, when they were talking about being away from residential care and what was threatened to them or what happened to them, they'd talk about being arrested. Their experience of a warrant being sought, which is a safe custody warrant, it's not a criminal warrant, but their experience of that is that the police come and they feel like they're being arrested and they're taken in the van. And so their experience is one that is entirely consistent with what they feel an offender would experience. So there is something about that I think shapes responses to young people. And we heard about that a lot, particularly about the way police view some of these young people, but not just police, players right across, individuals right across the system. So one of the things we've recommended is that not only do we need to change the terminology, get rid of warrants, get rid of absconding, and I'm really pleased to say those have been accepted by the department, and there's some changes in legislation underway at the moment. but also we need to change the culture and the attitudes about the way these young people are seen, and that means training. That means whether you're a residential care worker or your child protection worker or you're kind of the local police officer who's being called to assist locate one of these young people, you need to understand what experience of trauma looks like, what that can do in terms of behaviour. You need to understand what the system looks like. You need to be able to understand why a young person is behaving as they are, and then you're going to respond much more appropriately.
Yeah, and I think a consistent theme, I think, running through all of our conversations with commissioners so far has been how in Australia we've really so often failed to put children at the centre. And, you know, some groups are either invisible or they're pushed to the margins. And I think this is stepping on from what you just started to answer. You talk in your reports about the need for, you know, this child-centred approach within all of these systems. And we heard from your colleague, Justin Muhammad, just a couple of weeks ago about the need for this in terms of the youth justice system. One of your key recommendations to come out of your report and building on your previous inquiries is around a new model of care. So can you walk us through perhaps what this looks like and what's needed for young people, particularly in these cases, what's needed for children and young people to transition successfully from care and to care for those who go missing while they're supposed to be in care?
Yeah. So as you say, we have now in at least 3 reports said we need a very new, fundamentally different model of care in Victoria. And we could talk for another couple of hours about what that needs to look like. But at its heart, it needs to be a model of care that is genuinely able to provide a tailored response to individual children, that understands that if a child is coming into the care system, they'll have had some experience of adversity. They will need, to some degree, some therapeutic support. That should be the starting assumption, not the anomaly, which I have to say it is at the moment. We need a model of care where children are at the centre, where kind of children are asked about their experiences. Can't tell you how many child death inquiries we look at where all the way through a child's experience and contact with the child protection system, actually the child's never been asked what's going on for them. So right from that first contact with the system through to everything that happens after a child is taken into care, every placement decision, every decision about what's going to kind of happen to and for that child, the child should feel like they're being engaged and heard. They might not always get the final say, but what we hear consistently from children, and in our very first inquiry into the care system, in our own words, we spoke to over 200 children in care, and very consistently heard that children just don't feel that they have any say at all. Even when they're being moved, not only do they not have a say, they don't even get an explanation a lot of the time. So the new model of care has to bring a real culture and practice change to put children at the centre and engage with children very clearly and consistently. Then the tailored part means that, of course, for children, a home-based care kind of arrangement is going to be better. And so one of the recommendations that we've made is that we need, for those children who can't have a kinship placement, who don't have that available, and if they don't yet have access to a foster placement that's right, we need a far more sophisticated model for residential care. We need something that's not what we've had in Victoria until now, which is your standard 4-bedroom units, none of which we found operate along therapeutic terms, even though some of them are meant to. So we really do need something that is far more equipped to wrap around children, put them at the centre, hear what they have to say, understand what supports they need, and operate as a good parent would at its heart. Now, again, I could talk for a long time about all the ways in which we've recommended that occur. People can find those in our various reports, but that's the gist of it.
Yeah, we put links in the chat box to all of your awesome inquiries and reports. We'll turn to questions to give people a chance to dive into this. But Your report, your annual report has just been tabled in the Victorian Parliament today. Do you think the government is on track with its progress in response to your recommendation that it has accepted in principle to your various inquiries of out-of-home care?
Yeah, good question. One of the things that I'm really proud about, actually, in the annual report, pleased about maybe is a better word, is that for the first time we have, for a number of inquiries, not all of our inquiries, but we have published in very wordy tables at the back. We've published our recommendations and what government has said they're doing in response, and our assessment about how far that gets us. And we've started doing that particularly with the reports indeed since in our own work. So the last 3 reports, one of the ones that we've talked about, in fact, the 2 that we've talked about today, we don't yet have detailed responses from government about what they're actually doing. So it's been an interesting time for us making that public, but of course, even before we made them public, we assess what progress is being made. So, I mean, I have to be fair. We've looked pretty rigorously at all aspects of the out-of-home care system, well, most of them, and at the child protection system, even before children are taken into care. And we've made some very broad recommendations for fundamental change. And government and the department, I think, have absolutely been hampered or slowed with some of what they might have done by COVID last year. Victoria has been particularly affected since March 2020, as we know. So there are certainly some areas that I'm disappointed in the level of change, and I think the annual report today says that. But it also acknowledges that we have seen progress, and I have to say, I do think the Victorian government in recent years has acknowledged the structural underfunding in child protection. So we have seen investment in child protection workers in a way that we just hadn't seen for a very long time in Victoria. So we've seen demand for child protection rise year on year on year over a decade and had almost no investment. So this government has now sought to substantially improve on that. I'm hoping we will start to see some of the flow on from that, the consequences of that, once workers are brought on board and those vacancies are filled. We've also seen, as I said before, the extension of home stretch. So all young people who are leaving care now get support, financial and otherwise, until they're 21. That's pretty incredible. And we've seen some good investment in things like family preservation and reunification programs, some intensive kind of programs to work with children and their families so that kids can go back safely, and some investment to start changing that residential care model so that it's not just a 4-bedroom standard unit kind of model, that we've got some 2 and 3 bedrooms, and that there's capacity for a therapeutic care hub for some children in resi. So we're seeing some progress, and that's really important. And I need to recognise that the scale of change that is needed for these children is enormous. So I do recognise that, as well as saying, but we need more and we need it faster. And the reason I say that is because I see the consequences for children and young people today. And until we make the change of the nature required to the degree required, we're still going to see children and young people, for some of whom the care system compounds their harm, compounds what's being done to them. You know, for some that's not the case, but for too many that still is the case, and that's not acceptable. I think we as a community shouldn't be accepting that.
Yep, absolutely. I'll invite anyone who wants to come in now with a question. I know Sharon is usually keen to ask questions, so I'll just open it up. But I'm interested really in following up. You've mentioned a couple of moments of where the gendered nature of leaving care, and for those that have gone missing in care, and how it shapes their experiences of that. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about, well, you mentioned earlier around assumptions and ideas about resilience, about boys being perhaps more resilient, that really impacts on even if an assessment of risk is even made or not. Could you expand a little bit more about what are the other findings you've found around the gendered nature?
Yeah, look, absolutely. And I think it's interesting, as you kind of mentioned at the start, I've done work in lots of different settings that have very little to do with children. And I think analysis of gender and the way that it plays out for children in care, I think it's probably pretty far behind a lot of other settings, to be honest. So I think it's something that needs much more attention. Some of the issues that we've identified, you've touched on one. Certainly we find more evidence of children, of girls and young women being subject to sexual assault, sexual exploitation, sexual violence in inquiry into young people going missing. But we certainly found still a significant amount of evidence of that in respect of boys and young men. And as I said before, one of the really confronting pieces of information that we got was about the way gender plays out then in the assessment of risk, which isn't formalised, by the way. One of the recommendations we've made is we actually need a framework for people to assess risk, so that it's consistently assessed and well informed, so that there's not an assumption that just because a young person in care is male, then they're not vulnerable to rape and sexual abuse and sexual exploitation, because actually we know that they are, and that, you know, there needs to be a level of intervention for boys and young men just as much as girls. I think certainly if I look at some of our other functions, we see for children right across different types of care, in our reportable conduct scheme, we see experiences or allegations of physical violence and sexual violence or misconduct. And generally, overall, this is again a generalisation, but we do see more physical violence against boys and young men than girls and young women, and we see more incidents of sexual misconduct and sexual violence against girls and young women. But as to how the system engages with girls and young women and empowers them and treats with their own particular issues and needs and their own vulnerabilities, there we go, I've just used it, but the extent to which they may be more susceptible to being victimised in particular kind of ways, I've seen pockets where that's being tackled really well. Our Out of Sight report talks about a program called Power to Kids. That's a sexual safety program that's run by one of the providers here in Victoria, and that deals with gender and sex and sexuality and, you know, and rights and consent and empowerment in really kind of very, very sensible ways. That's why we recommended it, that it be rolled out across all of the out-of-home care system. But I don't see that kind of approach applied systemically. I think we've got some work to do there.
Yeah. Sharon, would you like to come in with your question?
Sure, thanks, Angie. For participants who don't know me, I'm Angie's colleague at the Children's Policy Centre. This has been such a great conversation, Liana. It's amazing work that you're doing. I had a question around the relationship between poverty and out-of-home care. And in everything that you're saying, what really strikes me most is that while we call the system care, actually what's missing is care. And systems generally government systems, institutions deal very, very badly with care. And we also see this in the welfare system, where there's not care for people. There's often a very punitive approach to the way we approach our welfare system in Australia. And I'm just wondering, Liana, if based on the work you've done and what you've heard from young people's experiences, if you could reflect on, I guess, how that lack of care across a number of systems in Australia starts to drive children into poverty. You know, we know that many children in Australia, not into care, I should say, we know that many children in Australia who end up in child protection and then in out-of-home care are actually notified due to neglect, which is often closely related to poverty and disadvantage. And so there are things that we could do to care for those families before children get into the system. But then you talked about the poverty young people experience when they leave care. So I'd just love to hear your reflections around those issues.
Yeah, look, I think there's no question. The correlation between the child protection system, and children who are brought to the attention of that system, and families who are brought to the attention of that system, and poverty is very clear and well documented, and we haven't as a commission sought to kind of re-document that. I was reminded of it in the last few days though, because I had reason to dip into our carers census, which is a good kind of census of all different kinds of carers, and amongst other things it asks different categories of carers about income level. And what it showed about kinship, and I said at the start, I think 3/4 of children and young people in care in Victoria are in kinship care. So they're with kind of family, mostly with extended family. And the income levels for those kinship carers are not across the board, but very high proportion living on very, very low income and effectively below the poverty line. So I think we do see some of that, not only in terms of the families that are brought to attention, but then it's played out in some of the families, extended families, where children are then placed in care. So I do agree that, I mean, overall, we've spent this conversation talking about the care system and that what needs to change there. We've done other work, another report at the Commission, also late 2019, that looked more at children and young people who are the subject of reports to child protection, and report, and often multiple reports, and child protection looks at it. The risk isn't that high, the harm isn't seen to be that high, the case is closed. There might be a referral to a voluntary service that doesn't result in anything, until there's a next report. The same happens. So the piece that I think we haven't talked about today, but is really important, because we have to improve our care system, but we don't want it to keep growing the way it is. That's not the answer. I think in Victoria, the number of children in care has increased by over 20% in just 3 years. We are on a kind of very steep trajectory to keep seeing more children in care. We have to tackle that. And the way I think to tackle that is to understand all of the factors at play for the families of the children who come into care. Some of that is poverty. Some of that is poverty intersected with family violence, mental health issues, substance abuse. These are the issues that are playing out in so many of the families that I have reason to kind of look at and understand what's been happening in there, and then what that means for the child. We have to have a better system and a better model, actually, of getting early intervention for those families. And some of that is about tackling poverty. Some of it is about kind of really good mental health support, good support to engage with substance abuse services. But if we don't get better at that early intervention, we're just going to keep seeing more and more children removed. And even if we pour all the money and do all the things that I'm recommending to improve the care system, many, many children in the care system, we know, still feel deeply connected to family, and will gravitate, back to family at some point. If we can actually stop them having to be removed in the first place, clearly that's a much smarter approach.
I'm just watching the Q&A. I don't want to dominate this, but I don't think anyone else has popped a question in yet. So I'll just perhaps ask one more question, which is back to the system itself, and our other question. You noted that in the reports that you've done, children and young people saying that they had no say once they were in care about the decisions made about them, that often they were never consulted. I've done some research with children and young people in care a while back, and while many of those children and young people said exactly the same thing, often those who had been consulted or asked for their view were asked in a way that was very adult-centred, that made them feel very uncomfortable. Children talk about sitting around a table, a boardroom table with adults, and then someone turning to them and saying, "What do you think?" Which is confronting as an adult, but as a 12-year-old, it's impossible. And I wondered if you heard children talking about the way in which they were able to participate on occasions where they were actually asked.
Yeah, yes, and we had the same thing. We had many, as I've said, young people saying, "We just were never asked, no, didn't have a say," and then others for whom they effectively hadn't been asked, because the only means by which they could have a say was in a construct that was completely intimidating for them and didn't make sense to them at all, and where they felt that if they said anything it wouldn't really be heard anyway, exactly as you've described. Oh, well, I went to a care team meeting because we asked questions in our own words, inquiry about care teams and what's your experience. And so I went once, but I wasn't going back again. And so what young people, when we ask more about, well, what would work better? It all comes back to the relationship and the trusted person. And again, that comes back to our findings about what children and young people told us and what we found when we looked at case files. Children often not having consistency in our work. We had, young people tell us, we've had 20 this year. In my time in care, I've had 90 workers at deep levels of distrust. And why even bother? Why even bother returning their call? Because they'll have moved on in 2 weeks' time. So they didn't feel they had anyone that they could actually speak to, engage with, and that's what they needed. So when we kind of said, well, what would work better than that kind of big meeting? They said, well, I need to be able to tell someone that I trust, with whom I have a relationship. I need to tell them what I want, and then I need to be able to trust that they'll feed that in. And if I'm feeling up to it, then I'll tell a bigger group of people and work with them. But I might not be, and I need to know that someone will do that on my behalf. So that's some of what we heard from them.
Hey, thanks, Liana. We're going to have to draw this to a close. I could listen to you for hours more. There's just so much that we could go into and so much that you've covered today. A reminder to everyone that this webinar series, which began with Bruce Adamson, the Commissioner for Children and Young People in Scotland, are all available on our website. We'll be back on Thursday, the 18th of November, when we'll be in conversation with the Commissioner for Children and Young People in Tasmania, Liana Buchanan, to talk about child-centred advocacy for wellbeing. But for now, Liana, thank you so much for being with us today. You've got a very busy day, and for sharing your insights on how we can better put children's needs and rights at the centre of out-of-home care arrangements. Thank you for everyone for joining us, and we hope to see you again in our next conversation. Thanks. Bye.